Nate Hollister lost his wife to winter and nearly lost himself trying to raise two boys alone on the windswept Wyoming plains. So, he rode east asking for a quiet partner to help him hold the pieces. When Clay Parker stepped off the stagecoach, a seamstress with nothing left but her sewing tin, she didn't expect to stay. But that night, as a storm rattled the rafters, a boy's cry pulled her into the mud and into their hearts. In a house still haunted by the scent of another woman's apron, Clay stitched her place with kindness. Will this quiet stranger become the glue that holds a family together, or will the wind take her too? Drop a comment if you believe some roots are sown, not born. Nathaniel Hollister didn't know how to ask for a wife, not the kind of asking that went on paper, but he also didn't know how to keep going without one. It had been 18 months since Sarah died, 18 months of burned biscuits, sleepless nights, and two boys who needed more than a man's silence. Her hair was pinned neat, but two strands had come loose in the wind, clinging to her cheeks like vines. Nate stood stiff beside the wagon, hat in hand. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it hadn't been this woman who met his gaze so directly. "Mr. Hollister," she asked. He cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." "Nate," she nodded. "Clay. It's short for Clara, but I don't use it." "All right," he said. Then, because he couldn't think of anything else. "Your bag?" She only had one, canvas fraying at the seams. He took it, and she followed him to the wagon. Neither of them said much on the ride back. The road to the ranch was rough ruts from spring runoff hadn't been filled yet. The wind carried dust and the smell of sagebrush. Clay studied the horizon. "It's wider than I pictured. Gets cold too," Nate said. "You been west before?" She shook her head. "Just in books." When they reached the ranch house, the boys were peeking out the front window. Finn ducked the moment she looked. Caleb didn't. Nate helped her down. "This is it," he said. The house stood plain whitewashed, low-roofed, with a porch that creaked under weight. A cottonwood tree leaned toward the barn branches still bare from winter. There was no garden yet, just dry earth waiting. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lye soap and old pine. A coat still hung by the door Sarah's. Nate hadn't moved it. Clay's eyes lingered there, but she said nothing. He showed her the room off the kitchen. It had a bed, a washstand, a window that faced the prairie. "This was Sarah's sewing room," he said, then hesitated. "I haven't used it." She stepped inside, ran her fingers along the sill. "It'll do." They didn't eat supper together that night. Nate made stew and left a bowl on the table. Clay unpacked in silence. Outside, the wind picked up long and low across the plains, like it was warning something. That night, Clay sat on the edge of the bed and opened her sewing tin. Inside, among spools of faded thread and bent pins, lay a folded clipping from the newspaper, the one with Nate's letter. She held it in her palm, feeling the creases. The rafters groaned overhead. Somewhere beyond the barn, a coyote called, once then again. The storm wasn't near yet, but it was coming. And Clay Parker, who had no people left and no place she truly called home, didn't flinch. Not yet, not tonight. She had come to help raise boys, but in this wind-whipped silence she wondered if she'd come to raise herself too. Clay woke early before the light crept through the small window of what used to be Sarah Hollister's sewing room. The air was cold, but she didn't shiver. Back east, the silence had always felt hollow, echoing with absence. Here, it felt full, expectant. The stove in the kitchen was already lit when she stepped out. Nate must have risen before dawn again, but there was no sign of him. A pot of water steamed gently. On the counter sat a pan of cornbread wrapped in a towel. She rolled up her sleeves and started to cook. The boys came in half an hour later, bleary-eyed and unsure. Caleb went straight to the table, but Finn lingered in the doorway like he wasn't sure this new arrangement was real. Clay offered a soft smile. "Would you help set the forks?" Finn looked to Caleb, who gave a little shrug. Slowly, Finn shuffled toward the drawer. She didn't press conversation. Instead, she laid strips of bacon into the skillet and stirred the cornmeal. The scent filled the cabin. The boys watched her work like she was doing something magical. "I fixed the curtain in the back room," she said quietly without turning. "You didn't have to," Caleb answered, voice still scratchy from sleep. "I know," Clay replied, her tone even, "but I did anyway." They ate in silence, but she caught the way Finn peeked over at her when he thought she wasn't looking. After breakfast, they slipped on their boots and headed out to the barn to do chores. Clay stayed behind, tying her hair up and scanning the room. Sarah's apron still hung on a hook by the door. White linen hand-stitched edges, a faded blue ribbon through the waist ties. Clay didn't touch it. Some things weren't hers to move, not yet. Instead, she opened her sewing tin and pulled out a mended shirt Caleb's. The sleeve had been torn clean through, likely from a fence nail. She threaded her needle and got to work. By mid-morning, the sun warmed the porch, and the air smelled of hay and warming earth. Clay stepped outside and spotted Nate in the distance repairing a stretch of sagging fence. He worked with precision but not speed, like a man who knew each movement saved energy for the next 100 tasks. He looked up, saw her watching, and tipped his hat. She nodded back, then went to tend the hens. That afternoon, she found the boys back at the table. Caleb had a dog-eared primer worn from years of use. Finn leaned close, sounding out syllables. Clay leaned over. "You ever read aloud at supper?" Caleb shrugged. "Sometimes. Mama used to listen." Clay didn't reply, just placed a hand gently on the table and nodded. "You can start tonight again if you like." At supper, Caleb read from the primer, stumbling over long words but steady. Nate listened quietly, hands folded on the table. Clay served stew warm bread and a quiet sort of peace. But peace didn't last long on the prairie. That night, the wind shifted, and with it came the smell of rain. Clouds moved fast over the plains, and by dusk the air was heavy. "Scout's not in," Finn said suddenly, peering out the window. Caleb stood. "He was with me by the creek this morning. Sometimes he sleeps in the barn," Nate offered, rising from his chair. "I'll check," Caleb said, already reaching for his coat. Before Nate could stop him, Caleb dashed out into the dark. Thunder rolled low, and Clay's heart caught in her chest. "I'll go after him," Nate said, grabbing his lantern and coat. Clay didn't hesitate. "Me too. You don't need to," he started, but she was already pulling on her boots. Outside, the wind lashed against their faces, and the first drops of rain fell. Clay followed the beam of Nate's lantern as they made their way toward the creek. The sky cracked open with lightning. She didn't think of her dress or her boots soaking through. She thought of a boy too young to understand danger, calling for a dog that might not answer. In that moment, she wasn't a mail-order bride. She was something else entirely. And tomorrow, they'd all wake different because of it. The storm broke hard, fast, and angry, like Wyoming had decided it had something to say. By the time Clay and Nate reached the barn, Caleb was nowhere in sight. "He's not here," Nate muttered, eyes scanning the dark horizon. "If he followed the creek, he's headed toward the old ravine." Clay's dress clung to her legs. The rain had soaked her to the bone, but she didn't care. Scout would have run for cover, she said. He'd never keep running in this. Nate turned lantern high. Then Caleb's out there alone. Clay didn't wait for permission. She grabbed a second lantern hanging by the barn door, lit it with trembling fingers, and followed the muddy trail leading toward the creek. Nate called after her once, but she was already moving. The wind howled, bending cottonwood sideways. Clay stumbled, boots sinking in wet ground. Each step was a prayer she didn't know how to finish. The lantern flickered, but she kept it steady. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Then she heard it faint but clear. "Scout, Scout." "Where are you, Caleb?" she shouted. "Caleb, answer me." A pause. Then a trembling voice. "Miss Clay." She followed the sound, veering toward a cluster of rocks by the creek bed. Her lantern cut through the dark, revealing a boy crouched in the mud, clutching a shivering golden retriever. Clay dropped to her knees beside them. "Sweet mercy," she whispered. "Are you hurt?" Caleb shook his head, but tears mingled with rain on his cheeks. "Scout got stuck in the water. I pulled him out, but I couldn't see the house after." She reached forward, wrapping the boy and the dog in her arms, shielding them as best she could. Her body trembled with the cold, but her voice was steady. "You did good, Caleb. Real good." A second light appeared through the trees. Nate, panting, soaked face set like stone. When he saw them, his shoulders dropped with relief. "I got him," Clay called. Nate reached them in a few strides, knelt beside his son, and pulled them both close. "You scared the life out of me, boy." Caleb pressed his face into Nate's coat. "I didn't mean to. I thought Scout would die." "I know," Nate murmured. "You've got your mama's heart, too big for your own good." They didn't speak again as they made their way back, Caleb bundled in Nate's arms, Scout padding close to Clay's side, tail low but wagging. The house was warm, glowing golden through the windows, like a beacon. Inside, Clay stripped off Caleb's soaked clothes, wrapped him in quilts, and made a pot of chamomile tea. Nate changed into dry clothes, set Scout near the hearth, and dried the dog with Sarah's old towel, quietly, reverently. Later, Caleb lay curled on the couch, Finn tucked beside him. Clay sat in the rocking chair, brushing hair back from the boy's damp forehead. "You were brave tonight," she whispered. Caleb blinked up at her. You came. Of course I did. He hesitated. Even though I messed up. She touched his cheek. Especially then. The room quieted. The thunder had rolled past, leaving only soft rain on the roof and the occasional crackle of the fire. Nate stood leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. He looked different in the glow, less guarded, more human. She's a good woman, he said softly, mostly to himself. Clay didn't hear him. She had started to hum low, slow, the same lullaby her mama used to sing back in Kentucky. The tune filled the room like warm wool. Finn's eyes drooped. Caleb's breathing slowed. Nate stepped closer. That song? Haven't heard it in years. My mama used to hum it when storms came. Nate nodded. Sarah used to sing too. Same time of night, same chair. Clay looked up. I'm not trying to take her place. He shook his head. You're not, but you're here now, and that means something. The fire popped. The boys slept. Scout snored soft by the hearth. And for the first time since Sarah died, Nate didn't feel like the house was falling apart. Not with Clay humming, not with the boys safe, not with the storm behind them, and not with morning quietly on its way. Spring came slow to Whisper Hollow, creeping in between frostbit mornings and afternoons that hinted at warmth. The cottonwood tree out front, bare since Clay's arrival, began to bud small green shoots like promises waiting to open. Clay stood at the porch one morning, wiping her hands on her apron as she watched the boys chase each other around the barn. Their laughter rang loud, clean, and unguarded. It had been 2 weeks since the storm, and something had shifted in the house. The boys no longer hovered at the edges. Caleb started leaving his books in the open, asking questions at supper. Finn called her Miss Clay with less hesitation, like the title might someday drop away entirely. Inside, Clay had hung new curtains stitched by hand, pale yellow with blue edging. Nate noticed them, but didn't comment. He'd begun to pause longer in doorways when she spoke, as if listening was something he was relearning. He still rose before dawn, still spoke little, but when she caught his eye, there was less armor behind it. Whisper Hollow's spring social landed on a Saturday, and Martha Crowley stopped by the ranch the day before with a pie and an expectant look. You bringin' the boys? She asked, smoothing her gloves on her lap. They could use some sunshine, and Finn might like the lemon cake. We were thinking about it, Clay said, glancing at Nate, who sat cleaning his bridle near the hearth. Martha's eyes twinkled. Well, if you do come, best wear something light. Weather's turning fair. The next afternoon, Clay wore her pale green dress, the only one she had that wasn't patched near the hem. She braided her hair and used the lavender water she'd saved since Missouri. Finn took her hand as they walked into the town square, Caleb kicking dust just ahead. Nate trailed beside her, sleeves rolled up, hat low. Whisper Hollow wasn't a bustling place, but on social days it came alive. Tables lined the edge of the square, pies and pickles laid out beside corn fritters and punch. A fiddle started up near the bandstand, and someone coaxed a dance out of a reluctant couple. They weren't 2 steps in before the whispering started. That's her, the mail-order woman. Strange choice. Pretty, but plain. He could have married someone local. Clay heard it all, let none of it show. But Nate's jaw flexed. They stood near the cotton candy table, the boys chasing each other between hay bales, when Eliza Braxton, daughter of the town banker, drifted over. Blonde, tall, and practiced in sweetness, she smiled wide at Clay. I suppose you're making do on the ranch, Eliza said, sipping her lemonade. Must be a shock coming from a city. Hard to get used to a real woman's work. Clay looked at her, measured and calm. I've been sewing since I was 10, cooking since I could reach a stove. I washed my mother's body when she passed, buried my father with my own hands, and crossed half this country by stagecoach alone. So, no, Miss Braxton, I'm not making do, I'm building a life. Eliza's mouth twitched. Well, that's one way to look at it. Clay stepped forward, voice even. If you're worried about Nate Hollister's household, don't be. His boys are fed, his house is warm, and if he needed lace and ribbons, he'd have married someone else. Nate hadn't moved through any of it, but now, silently, he reached for Clay's hand. She didn't look at him, just let her fingers close around his. Later that evening, back at the ranch, the boys dug small furrows beneath the cottonwood tree. Clay showed them how to plant the snap peas, her voice soft as she worked the soil. Nate watched from the porch, arms folded. Inside, Clay laid out reading books in a corner of the living room, fashioning a little nook with pillows and a kerosene lamp. As dusk fell, a knock came at the door. Caleb opened it. A neighbor, Mr. Tillman, handed over an envelope. From the east, he said. Came in on this morning's post. Clay took it, her hands suddenly still. The handwriting was familiar. Her uncle's lawyer. She didn't open it, not yet. Outside, the cottonwood leaves rustled with new life. And inside, something else stirred. A past waiting to be answered. A home, perhaps asking to be chosen. The letter sat on the windowsill for 2 days before Clay opened it. She didn't hide it, but she didn't rush either. Nate saw it there resting beside the basket of mended socks and said nothing. He respected the space she needed, the quiet consideration. That's how they'd come to understand one another, without prying, without pressure, just presence. On the third morning, while the boys fed the chickens and Nate hauled hay to the north field, Clay unfolded the envelope and read the news slowly, lips moving slightly as she took in each line. Her uncle's house in Pennsylvania, 2 stories whitewashed with green shutters, was hers now, deeded clean, no contest, no lien, just hers. She sat for a long time, letter in her lap, thumb tracing the ink like it might tell her what to do. That night after supper, when the boys had gone to bed, she stepped onto the porch. Nate was there already, sharpening a chisel on the top step. He didn't look up, but she knew he'd been waiting. "I read the letter," she said. He nodded once. "It's yours then." She exhaled. "It is. Big place by Pennsylvania standards. 5 rooms. A porch swing I helped paint when I was 12. Nate ran the chisel over the whetstone. That's something you want to go back to. Clay leaned against the post. "I don't know. I thought I would. But out here, things grow, even in hard ground." Nate looked up, then eyes shaded but searching. "You saying you might stay, I'm saying I'm not ready to leave. Not before spring's fully here." He didn't say more, didn't need to. But a few days later, Finn woke coughing. It started small, just a morning rasp, but by evening his little chest rattled with every breath. His cheeks flushed hot, and he curled up on the couch beneath 3 quilts, eyes glassy. Nate sat with him through most of the first night, pacing the room jaw tight. Clay moved calmly, placing cool cloths on Finn's forehead, brewing teas from her traveling satchel, dried mullein elderflower, and a dash of honey. "This fever don't break by morning. I'll ride for the doctor," Nate said. Clay touched his sleeve. "Let me try one more poultice first. If it doesn't help, you go." Nate hesitated but nodded. The night dragged slow. Finn tossed and whimpered in sleep, little fists curling toward his chest. Caleb sat by his brother's side, reading aloud from the primer, voice cracking when he stumbled on the longer words. Clay's hands never stopped wringing cloths, stirring broth, tucking corners of quilts. At dawn, the fever broke. Finn's breathing steadied the red, drained from his cheeks, and he opened his eyes with a tired, croaky whisper, "Ma." The word fell out without thinking. No one corrected him. Caleb looked at Clay uncertain, then climbed up beside his brother and laid his head on her arm. Nate stood in the doorway, face unreadable. Later that afternoon, when Finn was resting and Caleb was outside feeding Scout, Nate slipped into the barn and began carving. He hadn't touched Sarah's whittling tools since the winter she passed, but his hands remembered. He shaved the edge of a smooth block of pine, shaping each curve with careful, quiet purpose. It wasn't elaborate. He wasn't that kind of man, but it was honest work, straight from the grain. By dusk, the carving took form, a small bird, mid-flight wings stretched. Nate rubbed beeswax along its back, smoothed the edges with his thumb. That night, he found Clay at the hearth, sewing a patch on Caleb's sleeve. He cleared his throat. She looked up. "I made you something," he said, and held it out. She took the carving gently, as if it might fly from her hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I didn't know what else to give," Nate said quietly, "but if you're still thinking about Pennsylvania, I just wanted you to have something from here." Clay held the bird against her chest. "I'm still thinking," she said, "but I already know where I've felt most alive." Outside, the cottonwood swayed in a gentle breeze. Inside, a family no one planned was becoming something real. One carved bird, one fevered boy, and one shared silence at a time. Nate didn't ask right away, not with words. After Finn's fever broke and spring fully stretched her limbs across the prairie, life at the Hollister ranch began to settle into something that looked suspiciously like peace. The snap peas pushed through the soil, Caleb took to leading morning prayers without being asked, and Clay found her mending pile smaller by the day. Nate watched all of it with quiet reverence. Some evenings she'd catch him carving again shapes, this time horses' birds, a little rocking cow for Finn. She noticed he whistled now, low and tuneless, but steady. He wasn't a man who rushed anything, but there was a new weight behind his glances, something building slow and sure as the fence line. One evening, while the boys were out skipping stones in the creek, Nate came in from the barn with his hat in hand. He didn't sit, didn't clear his throat like he usually did when nervous. He just stood by the kitchen table holding something small wrapped in a red kerchief. "I never bought a proper ring," he said, voice even. "Didn't have one for Sarah. She didn't ask." Clay looked up from her sewing. Her needle paused in the fabric. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a plain silver band, slightly scuffed, clearly worn. "This was my mother's," he said. "She gave it to me before I left Tennessee. Said to use it when I knew." Clay stared at the ring, then at him. Nate swallowed. "I never wrote that letter to find a servant, or a ghost to live in Sarah's shadow. I didn't know how to say it then. Still don't, but what we've built here, it feels like something worth naming." Clay set her sewing aside, hands folded in her lap. "I won't ever be her," she said gently. "I don't want her," he answered. "I want you." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of every meal shared, every boy's laugh, every quiet moment. They didn't fill with talk because they didn't need to. She stepped forward slowly, took the ring, then yes, she said. "I'll stay. And I'll marry you." They told the boys that night. Finn grinned wide like it made perfect sense. Caleb didn't say much, but later Clay found a drawing he'd left on her pillow, the four of them standing under the cottonwood tree, the words "Our Family" scrawled at the bottom, in crooked letters. They were married the next Sunday. Martha Crowley agreed to officiate. It wasn't her first time filling in when the traveling preacher was between counties. She arrived in a purple dress and a wide-brimmed hat that bobbed every time she nodded. They said their vows beneath the blooming cottonwood, its branches just beginning to rustle with baby leaves. Scout lay nearby, belly up in the grass, snoring softly. Clay wore a simple cream dress, hand-stitched with blue embroidery. Caleb stood beside Nate Finn, held her hand, and the wind blew just enough to carry Martha's words like a benediction across the yard. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," she said. "May your roots grow deep and your joys grow wide." That night, over biscuits and blackberry jam, the boys didn't wait for permission. Ma Finn said, tugging at her sleeve, "Can I sleep in your room tonight?" She smiled. "Not tonight, sweetheart, but you can stay until you drift off." Caleb looked at her with a seriousness beyond his years. "You're not going back east, are you?" Clay brushed his hair from his forehead. "Not for anything that would take me from you." And just as they settled into this new rhythm, this new name for what they were, a second letter arrived. Another one from Pennsylvania. She opened it by the window, Nate beside her. This one offered not just inheritance, but opportunity. A partnership to sell the house or return and manage it as a boarding home. Clay set the letter down slowly. A choice was being handed to her again. But this time she wasn't choosing for survival. This time she'd be choosing for love, for family, for where she truly wanted to be. The decision wasn't made quickly. Clay sat with that second letter for nearly a week, rereading it by lamplight while the boys slept and Nate ran fence lines under widening skies. She wasn't torn out of doubt, but out of respect for what she'd built and what she'd left behind. Nate never pressed her, not once. He kept to his work, but each evening when they shared the porch, she saw it, the quiet brace in his shoulders, like he was preparing for goodbye. Then one morning Clay said, "I need to go back, just to see it, make peace with it if nothing else." Nate nodded slowly. "You want company?" She looked at him with a softened smile. "I want family." And so they packed. The journey east was long but steady. The boys had never ridden a train, and Finn couldn't stop pressing his nose to the window. Caleb stayed close to Clay, glancing now and then at Nate like he was memorizing the feel of them all being together. Pennsylvania greeted them with damp air and blossoming dogwoods. The town hadn't changed much, same brick storefronts, same slow-turning carriages. Clay stood in front of her uncle's old house on Willow Street, staring up at it like she was seeing it for the first time. The porch swing still hung by the door. Inside, dust and silence met them like old friends. The rooms felt smaller than she remembered, and colder, not for lack of heat, but for lack of use. They stayed 3 nights. Clay swept out corners and opened every curtain. Nate fixed a sagging cabinet door. Caleb and Finn played marbles on the wooden floorboards and read books in the same spot where Clay used to sit as a girl. On the second day, a knock came at the door. A young couple stood outside May and Thomas Keller, newly married. May had once been the daughter of the town's seamstress. Clay had hemmed her skirts as a teenager. Word got around, May said, twisting her wedding band, that you might sell. We're expecting. Don't have much, but we're dreaming of a place with space to breathe. Thomas added, we'd take care of it, honor it, even if we had to fix it room by room. Clay didn't answer right away. She watched them, their hands clasped, the way they looked at the house like it was more than wood, it was hope. That night, she sat on the porch swing, fingers tracing the chain. Nate stepped out, coffee in hand. You've been quiet. She took a slow breath. This house taught me to survive. It held my grief, my stubbornness, my starting over. He said nothing, waiting. But out west, she smiled faintly. That's where I learned to live. The next morning, she handed May the key and said only, make it a home. Clay left the house lighter than when she arrived, not because she'd given something up, but because she'd let something go. They returned to Whisper Hollow, just as the first seedling stretched out under the sun. The cottonwood tree was fuller now, casting wide shadows over the porch. Scout barked wildly when the wagon pulled in, tail spinning like a windmill. Nate carried Finn inside on his hip, while Caleb ran straight to the barn to check the chicks. Clay paused on the porch, breathing in the scent of fresh dirt and late spring. That night, over stew and warm cornbread, Caleb asked, was the house nice? It was, Clay said, but it wasn't mine anymore. Finn yawned into her shoulder. This one is. She looked to Nate, who took her hand under the table thumb, brushing her palm. Yes, she said quietly, it truly is. And somewhere in the fields beyond the window, the prairie wind picked up gentler, this time more like a whisper than a warning, a wind that carried them home, and a home that finally could carry them forward. By early summer, Whisper Hollow had turned a lush green Nate hadn't seen in years. The snap peas were climbing, the boys were barefoot more than not, and Clay moved about the house with a new stillness, like her very breath had slowed to match the rhythm of the prairie. She didn't say anything at first, just took longer pauses by the window, touched her belly absently when no one was looking. It was Caleb who noticed first. They were sitting on the porch one evening, sharing slices of peach pie, when he leaned in close and asked, you sick? Ma, Clay blinked, then smiled gently. No, sweetheart, just tired in a new kind of way. Nate turned to look at her, then his fork halfway to his mouth. She set her plate down carefully. We're having a baby, she said, steady and quiet. The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was awe. Nate's face stilled, like the news had reached deeper than language. Finn, wide-eyed, asked, really? Like a baby? Clay nodded. Nate stood, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the barn. Clay didn't follow. She knew Nate well enough by now to recognize when his silence wasn't distance, but reverence. He returned 20 minutes later carrying something wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table and unwrapped it slowly, a tiny wooden cradle. The base carved from pine, the legs curved in that steady, honest way of Nate's hands. It wasn't polished, not yet, but it was real, sturdy. I started it, he said softly. The night you gave May the house key. Clay reached for the edge fingertips, brushing the smooth rail. You knew? He nodded. Not for sure, but I hoped. Later that week, the skies turned sour. The first storm hit while Nate was up north, with a neighbor helping drive stray cattle off the ridge. Clay was home alone with the boys, heavy with child, and watching the horizon split open with flashes of silver. Rain came hard, hammering the roof, flooding the back pasture. Caleb ran in, soaked, shouting, the peas are drowning. Clay didn't hesitate. She threw on her boots, grabbed 2 empty feed sacks, and together with the boys, they raced into the rain. They dug shallow trenches with their hands to redirect the water-piling earth into makeshift barriers. Clay's dress clung to her belly, round beneath soaked cotton. Finn slipped and skinned his knee, but didn't cry. Caleb pulled him up, and the two kept going side by side. By the time Nate rode in at sundown, his boots splattered with mud. The worst had passed. He found them all on the porch, muddy, tired, but laughing. The garden had been saved mostly. You all right? He asked, dropping to one knee beside Clay. She nodded, just winded, and proud. He looked at the boys, both grinning. You two take care of things. Caleb puffed his chest. She led the charge. That night, with the storm grumbling off toward the mountains, Clay soaked her feet in warm water, while Nate ran his hands through her hair, drying it gently with a towel. You scared me, he said quietly. All this your condition. Clay leaned back into his hands. I'm not made of glass, Nate. I know, but you matter now. She looked up at him. I mattered before. You did, he said. But now, you're home. She took his hand, pressed it gently to her belly. The baby kicked once, sharp and sure. They didn't speak after that. Words would have just gotten in the way. The next morning, the boys found the cradle in the center of the room, now lined with soft muslin and hay. Finn added his old blanket. Caleb tucked in a smooth river stone shaped like a heart. Clay stood in the doorway, one hand on her hip, the other resting protectively below her ribs. And Nate, standing beside her, said what he hadn't dared aloud until now. She's nearly here. And Clay whispered back, We're ready. She came at dawn, the prairie still wrapped in blue-gray hush, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clay had felt the first deep pull just after midnight. Not sharp, not sudden, but low and insistent, like the earth shifting under her feet. Nate rose instantly when he heard her breath change. He didn't ask questions, didn't fumble, just moved with the calm urgency of a man who'd plowed through snowstorms and wildfire alike. Martha Crowley arrived an hour later, cheeks pink from the ride hair pinned in a haphazard twist under her bonnet. You couldn't wait till the sun was up, she joked as she removed her gloves. Clay managed a grin through gritted teeth. Babies don't care much for schedules. The boys stayed close to the kitchen scout curled at their feet. Caleb tried to read aloud, but his voice trembled too much, so he just held Finn's hand and stared at the ticking clock. Out back, the cottonwood swayed gently in the morning breeze, its full summer canopy glowing gold under the rising sun. And then the cry. It split the quiet like a church bell, clear alive, certain. Nate came out onto the porch, first hands shaking, as he reached for the railing. Martha followed, holding a bundle wrapped in soft linen. She's healthy, got lungs like a barn owl, she said with a smile. Caleb and Finn came rushing to the door, eyes wide. Martha passed the baby into Nate's arms. He stared down like he was seeing something holy. His rough thumbs traced the edge of her tiny face, eyes misted with something he didn't try to hide. Inside, Clay rested hair damp against her brow, face pale but glowing in the morning light. She's got your nose, Nate whispered, brushing a finger along the baby's cheek. Clay turned her head toward him. And you're quiet. Lord help us, he murmured with a chuckle, then kissed her forehead. The boys approached slowly. Finn clutched the corner of Nate's sleeve. What's her name? Clay looked to Nate. They hadn't spoken one aloud yet, but both knew. June, he said, because she came when the land was full and the world felt new again. They spent the morning under the cottonwood wrapped in blankets. Nate carved a notch into the tree trunk, just a small one like he'd done for Caleb's first word and Finn's first lost tooth. That evening, the family sat on the porch, wereflies blinking along the fence posts, supper plates cooling in their laps. June slept in the cradle by Clay's feet, the soft rise and fall of her chest, steady as the hush of prairie grass in the wind. Think she'll like it here? Caleb asked. She already does, Clay answered. She was born into love. That's more than most get. Scout barked once at a squirrel, then lay back down. The wind picked up gently, no longer the harsh, stormy breath it once was, but a lullaby of rustling cottonwood leaves and distant meadowlark songs. Nate turned toward Clay, his voice low. You remember the night you arrived? I remember thinking the wind might tear the roof off, she said, smiling faintly. And now Clay looked around at the boys, at the cradle, at the tree overhead, and the house glowing behind them. Now I know it was trying to carry something in. Finn leaned against her leg, sleepy. What did it bring? She bent and kissed the crown of his head. Us. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the boys tucked in, Nate stood at the doorway holding June. He rocked her slowly, whispering, We were waiting for you, little one. Not just me. All of us. We didn't know it, but we needed you. He turned and looked out toward the cottonwood, now towering, now whole. And we'll hold on. Through storms and loss and seasons we ain't seen yet. We'll hold on. The cradle creaked as he laid her down. Clay stepped beside him, her hand in his. And as the lantern burned low and the wind sighed through Whisper Hollow, the home they'd built, not from plans but from presence, stood solid beneath the sky, rooted, steady, and full.